Awesome. Thank you as always, Caroline. And I don't know if you had to have Tim and Doug for the last webinar, but you are stuck with us. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate all your production across the year as well. Today we're here in the fourth of our webinar series around the grade 8, all around demonstrating clear differentiation. Keep your chat box open because I would love if anyone in the webinar knows who this individual is on the screen in front of you. Who is on the screen in front of you there? Drop it into chat. Sean is first in with Gladwell. Stephen is first in with the full name, Malcolm Gladwell. But yes, that is Malcolm Gladwell. He's a very recognizable character. But for those of you unfamiliar with Mr. Gladwell, his first breakthrough, let's call it pop psychology business book, was The Tipping Point. At this point, man, I don't know, Tim, 20 years ago now, maybe?
Yeah,
it's been a while.
2000. Yep,
been a while.
So. Yeah.
He has since written many more. He charges a rather hefty speaker's fee, which is often why you get Tim and Doug instead of Malcolm Gladwell at your SKOs. But interestingly enough, he's most well known for this argument of the tipping point. And as you can read in the subhead, how little things can make a big difference. But I wonder how many of you would be able to identify this individual who I've been told looks a little bit like me, which is kind of frightening, but true. If anyone knows this individual, I would send expensive gifts through the mail to Reed and anybody else. But this gentleman's name is Morton Grodzins. Morton Grodzins was a professor at the University of Chicago back in the 40s and 50s. And interestingly enough, it was this gentleman who actually coined the term, the tipping point. You can actually find that term in Dr. Grodzins' research paper, specifically in his area of study. He was studying white flight out of the city of Chicago to the suburbs. And he was the one who coined that term 40 plus years before it appeared in Gladwell's seminal book that you all seem to know about. Why is it that Morton Grodzins is lost to history, but Malcolm Gladwell is very well known for an unoriginal idea? Well, what was the difference? The difference between Mr. Gladwell and Dr. Grodzins was indeed the story that they told. And that's ultimately what demonstrating clear differentiation is all about. You may be coming onto this call thinking, I can't actually think of precisely how my company or my product or service is different. What story do I need to tell that's going to demonstrate clear differentiation, enough so that buyers can provide you feedback with excellence on how you can get better at that differentiation as you go? The story makes all the difference. But here's, again, just the foundation of this webinar series that Tim and I have been doing is this statistic right here, that 53% of deals that your sellers are pursuing this quarter, trying to close out here in the next couple of weeks, 53% of buyers said that a losing vendor could have won the deal if not for missteps in the sales experience. Now, yes, all you math folks out there will very quickly say that that does mean that there are 47% of deals out there that might not have been winnable, maybe because of your product, the competition, you name it. But that's a pretty large percentage of deals that your teams are out there losing in the market today, that win-loss buyer feedback says you could have won, but for missteps in the sales experience. Now, across the literally 100,000 plus data points that we've collected from buyers through the years, demonstrating clear differentiation, I hate to say it, folks, but sellers haven't really gotten better at that over the years. In fact, if you look at 100,000 plus data points, the most common missteps that buyers cite in their feedback, the number one is that 79% of buyers present little, say they're selling, the folks that sold to them presented little or no competitive difference. That's 4 out of 5 buyers saying in their sales conversations, we don't see the difference between you and your competition. That's an astonishingly high number, and it's actually higher than what you'll hear from some of the industry analysts out there. You can find stats that say 69%, 72%, but actual win-loss data from real buyers say it's 79%. That's kind of absurd when you think about it. It's not just that, though. There are two big other ones: poor needs discovery and then lack of alignment with solutions. And then if you're not doing that correct, is it any surprise then that the buyer does not perceive any differentiation? They're not going to perceive differentiation on a solution set that they don't feel aligned to. Last but not least, and this, folks, this is just some great basic sales hygiene. This isn't even a complicated skill. But buyers, the third most cited misstep is that sellers just have a lack of timely response or interest in even fulfilling those requests to begin with. But Tim, I know you've been at this differentiation thing for quite some time, not just at Corporate Visions, but in your career before Corporate Visions as well. And I love your thoughts on this 79%. Like, why does that remain such a thorny challenge for sellers to actually demonstrate to buyers that they are different?
Well, I think anybody could argue that in any given category anymore, if you're a company that's viable and considered, that the majority of what you sell, like the majority at face value, it does look, sound, and smell the same as anybody else. So the problem is that when people go to tell their story, they usually tell the customer the same things because they've done, like, I'm going to do some voice of the customer research. They're going to tell me what their problems are, and then I'm going to show them how my solution solves for that. And really that sounds right, but it puts you right into a commodity or parity trap because everybody's got the same feedback from the customers and everybody's got a similar portfolio. So you end up unwittingly telling the exact same story. The other factor, just the laws of physics and selling, is that the buyer in some ways wants you to look the same because they want to beat you up on price, and they want to convince you that you are the same, and there's really no reason to pay a premium. So you're kind of getting it from both angles. The idea that your product team isn't giving you a distinct story because they're looking at commoditized voice of the customer research and serving up the same three things that everybody else does. And your buyer's like, yeah, it'd be really easy if we could just make everybody look alike so that we could just go for the lower price. And then that becomes the differentiation. So what I always say is that price is not, when people argue on price, it's not a budget problem. It's a differentiation problem. And many times your customers put you there so that they pull the price card. So anyways, there's a number of ways to look at it, but it is a beast. And hopefully today we will give people some ways to crack this.
Well, and I would even say there's probably another problem as well that I know, Tim, you and I have seen a bunch, which is, do sellers even actually know from buyers at all whether they are communicating their differentiation crisply? In fact, because we know a lot of organizations don't have a structured way to get buyer feedback from the buyer into the hands of their reps. So even though this number may be 79%, I wonder what percentage of that 79% is actually getting that feedback and then changing their behavior as a result. And the reason I raise that is some statistics that we've shared on prior webinars, but I think is important to share in this context too, because in fact, out there across a data set of 7,000 sellers, we actually dove into the data to find that there's a ton of sales reps that do not receive feedback from their buyers. Their company may do win-loss analysis, they might not, but there's a lot of sellers that don't get to hear what their buyers are saying about their selling performance. And interestingly, in this work that I know, Tim, you worked on with Dr. Lefbani down at Florida State, in a series of sellers who did not receive buyer feedback in 2022, did not receive buyer feedback in 2023, this year's been incredibly difficult. Win rates in that subset of sellers are down 22%. Now, it's been no picnic for this next group either, but for sellers that did not receive buyer feedback in 22, but did receive at least 3 pieces of buyer feedback in 2023, their win rates were down, yes, but they were down far less. In fact, there's a 40% boost in win rate simply in the mere act of sharing that feedback. So I wonder, Tim, and I know you and I have been talking about this data a lot, but I wonder how much of not just the differentiation problem, but any skill problem is simply the fact that sellers don't have a great mechanism to know and understand what buyers are actually thinking about. And the feedback that buyers do provide, is that actually making its way to the seller so that you can actually achieve this 40% difference in win rate that you see here? And I love your thoughts on that, Tim.
Here's what I'd say. These 7,000 reps that we followed, the same 7,000 in 2022 as they are in 2023. They're at the same companies, arguably selling, not the same companies. There's a couple dozen companies in here, but they're still at their same companies. And they are selling arguably the same products and services year over year. And so why the difference? We've controlled for everything but we could argue the one difference is somebody got some feedback about their performance and they changed something. And we're going to give you on this webcast some very specific ideas how to differentiate your solution and tell a good story. But this to me simply says, if you just differentiate the experience that you create as a seller, and you differentiate it, like you go and tidy up that experience based on what your buyers are telling you, you can win more deals. So this idea of 53% of losses were avoidable. They were unforced errors, something that happened that was within your control in the sales experience. Like that's differentiation. Like it's a difference maker. So what you're going to hear from us is a broad definition of differentiation today. How can you find it in your products and services? We'll cover that. But we're also going to talk about how you can cover it from the standpoint of your story and how well you tell that story. And many times it's not the hand you're dealt, it's how you play the hand. We have this great study about poker that simply says the best players win 88% of the time. The best hand wins only 12% of the time. So the best player can play a poor hand and still win. And we believe that's true in sales. So what you're going to hear from us is that your sales team with their lips moving is the last bastion of differentiation. And again, your customer feedback gives you some helpful hints on how you might change that dynamic.
And for those of you that have been following Tim and my webinar series since September, the last time I was in London, I'm here again today. You know that there are 8 make or break selling skills across the buyer journey. We covered off on expert insights back in October as the first. In fact, I think Tim and I would both agree that sometimes the differentiation gets completely lost if you're not delivering expert insights. And the expert insight is really what differentiates you from the competition. The ability to align solution to needs. You saw that a moment ago. The second biggest thing that buyers cite as being solution misalignment with the needs that they have. Covering off on clear differentiation today. The ability to articulate meaningful value, help justify decisions. For those of you that joined Jim Druckery and I in November, you remember that help justify decisions right now in today's selling environment is the number one skill. It's the number one gap in skill between wins and losses right now. The best sellers are really differentiating themselves and their ability to help their buyers justify decisions. Negotiate creatively, ever more importance in a procurement-driven buying environment. The ability to deliver compelling communications, and last but not least, that skill that buyers cite that, man, is it a skill or is it just great hygiene around resolving concerns responsibly? These are the great 8, the 8 buyer-driven, observable, coachable skills that buyers expect to see from sellers across their buying journey. And today we're going to talk, again, as Tim said, squarely on clear differentiation. And before we dig in, though, I always like to get the pulse of man, Tim, we've got 167 folks on the webinar right now. Folks want to hear about differentiation. So let's put up a poll. Let's put up a quick poll. Would love to get a baseline of where you believe your teams are. So here's the question. How well do you believe your sales team demonstrates your unique capabilities compared to your strongest competitor? How well do you believe your sales team demonstrates your unique capabilities compared to your strongest competitor? Let's see how many answers we can get in the chat. And on the poll question, feel free to drop in the chat sort of your reasoning behind your response. Why did you respond the way you did in the poll? Drop some things in the chat. Tim and I will pick up on a few of those as we go. Let's see if we can get to 100 responses in the poll. I'm sensing some good honesty in the poll right now, which is good. We're at 99, we're over 100. There we go. Caroline, if you could end that poll and share those results back with the group. So you're looking at the results right now. And if you want, take a quick screen capture of those results, because on a subsequent slide, we're going to see what buyers actually say to this question. I worded this very specifically because it's the same wording we use when surveying buyers about the experience with your sales team. And so I see in this data a bell curve, which one would expect, with a little bit more on the slightly better side, a little bit more on the slightly inferior. But most folks on the call today in the middle of the pack around differentiation, a little bit to the exceptional side. Now, keep that in mind. Again, take a quick screen capture of it. And again, drop into chat your rationale for why you put the answer that you did into that poll. And Caroline, we can stop sharing those results here, because I want to show you again, what does the most recent buyer data from our own win-loss efforts across our clients actually say in this moment? Because it's the key question. Just how different are you at the present moment? And so you might have seen in those polling responses, there were 7 answer choices in that last poll. And think of those 7 answer choices as all the way from, as you saw, exceptional, much better than your nearest competitor, all the way to much worse. So let's see the data. What are buyers saying today about seller differentiation? You already know it's top on their list. 79% of them saying they're not perceiving it. But what do they say? Well, in wins, when your sales team wins a deal, buyers are saying your team score plus 1.7. So that'll be about moderately better. Actually, a little bit better than the average in that poll question a moment ago. Take a look at the losses. In losses, they're saying negative 0.9, slightly worse. Not terrible, slightly worse. You're probably scratching your head for a moment right now on, wait a minute, Doug, how come buyers are rating my sellers better in no decision than they are in a win? That, like, intuitively, there's some cognitive dissonance there. Well, what it says to us, and it gets back to Tim's comment at the top of the webinar, true differentiation right now, based on the data, seems to be a necessary component of winning, but not necessarily sufficient to win in this moment in time. Because if you look at the win-loss delta here, you see a delta of 2.6. For those of you who joined us last month for Justified Business Decisions, you remember that the gap for justification was 3.4, an even bigger gap. So in fact, it's differentiation. Yes, you must be different. But we would argue it's differentiation paired up with a couple other of these great 8 skills, whether that's justification, whether that's expert insights, whether that's simply the seller being the differentiation, him or herself, in the story that they tell. Necessary but not sufficient, because this plus 1.9 right here, folks, that tells us that folks are communicating some differentiation, even in their no decisions, but that wasn't enough to get them over the hump. And so, Tim, I know you've got an anecdote from one of our clients a couple months ago where their win-loss feedback was saying they were different, but it didn't fully matter. And I wonder if that applies here.
Yeah, we were invited to come in and help fix the story around differentiation and think product or software or service, sort of like, oh, can you help us differentiate our thing? And we went out and did a look back at their wins and losses, sent out some surveys, got some feedback. And what was interesting, when you look at those great 8 skills, what they found is that their clients, thought they were differentiated enough, but when asked like what made the difference in choosing this vendor, they picked provide expert insights. And so what was interesting, this was in like cybersecurity space. It turned out that they weren't necessarily as worried about whether the product was different from the competitor's product. It's how they felt about you as a company Like provide expert insights means I trust it. I trust you. I believe you know what's going on. I believe you're on top of things. And, in a competitive matrix, your products look more or less the same. But the difference, now, mind you, the differentiation with the capital D was the ability to provide expert insights. So I don't want to confuse us here because we are going to talk about how to extol the virtues of your product in a way that is differentiated. But we also just want you to be keenly aware that oftentimes customers think of differentiation a little more holistically, and that you've got more options to create differentiation than you think. I saw somebody say here, we sell rags. So how is that differentiated? Well, we'll talk about some ways to differentiate, because we always joke that we work with several banks who sell money, and money is as commoditized as you get. And if you're a bank that sells the money for more money, like your money's priced higher than other money, how do you even differentiate that idea? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's dig into differentiation and how you can do it with the solutions in hand, and come out on the other side on top.
Again, think back to Gladwell and Grodzins. Grodzins had a original concept. Gladwell did not, yet Gladwell told the better story. And the road to differentiation and the road to a differentiated story is paved with good intentions. But what often happens is that sellers fall into one or more of the three deadly sins of differentiated messaging. The first, too much unnecessary information. And the key word here, folks, is unnecessary information. Think about the latest deck that your teams have built, or the product brochure, or just the speeds and feeds and features of all the things that you are trying to communicate in your selling conversations. How much of that is truly necessary to the buyer? Because what does too much information do? It increases what our chief neuroscientist, Dr. Carmen Simon, talks about, cognitive load, and specifically cognitive overload. Too much unnecessary information in your selling conversations. Buyer doesn't know where to focus. Buyer doesn't know what's most important about that information. It increases their cognitive load more than what they should. Second deadly sin, not messaging from your buyer's point of view. It seems rather simple, but too much of your messaging, again, if you go to your content management platform, HighSpot, Allego, Seismic, and just download an asset, read down that asset. How much of that messaging was from your buyer's point of view versus your company's point of view? And the third, if you thought number two was simple, number three is probably the simplest. But too many sellers just flat out fail to articulate with words in front of the client what is different about you. They fail to say it out loud. They assume it rather than claiming it. And so these three deadly sins are the big challenges when you think about differentiation in the messaging you use. Because ultimately, you have a choice as a seller, sales leader. Maybe we've got some marketers on the call today as well. How do you create messaging that overcomes the three deadly sins? Well, if you've got a piece of paper, this is perhaps, these next two slides are perhaps the two simplest pictures that Corporate Visions has ever produced. Wildly simple, and yet have so much information that sellers just fail to heed in their client conversation. So grab a pen. I've got the one from the hotel that I'm staying at here, and a notebook, and just draw a very simple picture that looks like the one that's about to come on your screen. So first, just draw one circle, and in that circle, write the word you, or maybe just write the name of your company. And that circle stands for everything that you and your sales team, your marketing team could talk about in a customer conversation. Second, draw a second circle and write the word prospect or client or customer, whatever word works for you, such that in classic Venn diagram fashion, they overlap. Now, meant to signal that, of course, there are things that your company does that your prospect cares about. As you heard Tim say earlier, you're probably not even in the game without that overlap between those two circles. And in fact, isn't that circle kind of the basis of an RFP? Prospect thinks, well, I know that this company can probably do this for me. I'm going to send them this 30-page RFP. Now, I imagine you're probably quickly picking up that there's one big circle missing from the picture right now. Add that circle in, and that circle is your competition. Clearly, competition's got a set of great things. And of course, you can draw the diagram on your piece of paper based on how much your capabilities overlap with the competition's capabilities. It may be more than what you see here on the screen. But ultimately, where too many organizations, marketing in their demand gen, selling and sales conversations, I'd even offer customer success in their renewal and expansion motions, spend far, far too much time talking about the things that sit at the intersection of these three circles. And as you can see on the right, jot down on your page, that's value parity. Something that you can do, yes, and you may even do it well, but it's also something the competition can do. The customer does need it. And so there's a gravitational pull in differentiation conversations towards this value parity box. And to Tim's point earlier, if you are talking about things in value parity, you ultimately end up competing on price because, folks, your prospects love to talk about things in there because they can beat you up on price. So then there's one spot in the diagram you just drew where you want to be spending far, far more time, and that's in your value wedge here on the left-hand side. This is where you do overlap with what the prospect needs with something that you uniquely provide. Now, again, based on your diagram, for some of our clients, that value wedge is more of a value sliver. For some of our clients, the wedge is pretty large. It depends. But I'd love to just get a gut check, again, just the pulse of the room as you look at those two areas, value parity in the middle, value wedge on the left. Caroline, could you put up the second polling question that we've got for the group? And again, just we're in a safe space here. But on the second polling question, what percentage of time do your sellers focus on value parity? Value parity, the middle wedge. Far too much, more than we should, about the right amount, or less than we should? Where do you see? And while those poll questions are coming in, Tim, what have your years of developing client messages told you about this distinction between value parity and the value wedge?
Here's the thing is because they know that customers care about something, people will spend a lot of time on it. But it's the same thing that everybody else is spending time on in their messaging. And they spend too little time on, even if it's a value sliver, you have to make that sliver or wedge the most important thing that the customer is considering. What you're hoping to do is at the end of the day, the customer goes, all things considered equal, boom. And it doesn't have to be a lot of things. I think people panic if they think their value wedge is too small. And I'm like, it's not about the size of your value wedge. It's about the story you put around the value wedge. How important you make that thing. Like, it's like got to be important to the customer. It's like, make it the most important to the customer. So it really comes down to the story you tell and the skill with which you tell it around your value wedge. It doesn't have to be how big your value wedge is because they already presume you're more or less the same. And they're just like honestly, at some level, they're just itching to see a difference. Like, just throw me a freaking bone here, so I can make a decision. The thing about what's really interesting about human decision making, the reason some people can't make a decision is we give them, as we said earlier, too much information. And as a result, because value wedge is as small as it is, they're like, like everything seems the same here. And you bury it, like you bury the lead, you bury the value wedge. It's got to be the lead. It's got to be the main thing. And they got to see why, all things considered equal, it's the most important thing. Like, this is the linchpin to all these other things. And that comes in how you tell the story around your value wedge. So don't panic if it's not a whole pie, that it's a wedge or it's a sliver. That this is not a calorie count game here. This is about how you frame the story and help the customer see that as their most important prioritized need, all things considered.
And you see the results in front of you. Thank you, Caroline, for sharing those. And the group falls down where I would expect it would. I think most sellers over egg towards the value parity areas to the absence of the value wedge. But to build on Tim's point, one of our colleagues, Rob Perillian, as he teaches this concept, I think is fond of saying, and accurately so, when the client committee sits down to make their choice, they're going to have their criteria. They're going to have the half moons, half circles, full circles, etc. The value wedge is all about, are the things that you are best at, are they appearing at the top of the list? The things that you get the full circle for, are they at the top of that list of consideration? And how do you make that happen? Well, you have to know how to achieve the value wedge. How do you talk about it? What is it specifically? Value wedge has 3 tests. And again, I told you the Venn diagram was simple. This one's even more simple. It's just a triangle with some words. Because the value wedge has 3 tests. So if you take out that value wedge, draw a separate triangle on your page. First and foremost, because it was, remember, in that circle of the prospects, your value wedge must be important to the prospect. Here's where I tie that point in with Tim's expert insight point before. Sometimes, through expert insights, you have to make it important to the prospect. Prospect may not come to the table thinking it's most important, but you're going to use expert insights to ensure it is important to the prospect. So that's number one. The second, this is again one of those obvious statements, but worth saying out loud. Is it unique to you? And again, to Tim's point, doesn't necessarily have to be a fee, a speed, a feature. It could be your service model. It could be how you deliver it. It could be the overarching package it comes in. What's the thing that is unique to you within the offering? Last but not least, is it defensible? Referenceable case studies, customer data. Do you have the story buttoned up behind it that makes it as defensible as possible? So again, wildly simple in theory, wildly simple in terms of picture to write down. It is hard work that we spend truly days with some of our client teams digging into what is most important to the prospect, unique to you, and defensible, so that you can find the value wedge so you can demonstrate clear differentiation for your prospect. But once you've found it, finding it is step one. Telling the story is the more important step two. Because we see a lot of organizations who know their differentiation, but remember that second deadly sin. The second deadly sin of not messaging from the buyer's point of view. So you could identify the best differentiation all day, but if you don't message it from the buyer's point of view, it will be lost in the mind of your buyer. So how do you correct for that? Again, the differentiation pictures, not difficult. Doing it, pretty hard. So draw another triangle if you're following along at home, or the cheater way. Take a couple screen captures at the end. But if you think about it, every communication of your value wedge needs to communicate 3 things. It needs to communicate what it is. So what is the tangible thing? What does make you different? It also needs to communicate what will that differentiated capability enable your buyer to do better or differently. Let me say that again. What will your differentiated capability enable your buyer to do better or differently? Said another way, what action will your buyer be able to take that they cannot take today? And then last but not least, what will that all ultimately mean for your buyer? What's the outcome that they are going to be able to have because they have purchased your feature? And where a lot of folks get stuck, again, that second deadly sin, well, actually all 3. First deadly sin, too much information. So what happens in that deadly sin? Too many sellers just rattle off all of the information possible about what your differentiated capability is. And they dwell and they live in this area down here. And frankly, most sellers are pretty good at that. They're pretty good at telling you what the capability is. Features, feeds, speeds, delivery modality, service, support, you name it. But that is not going to get your buyer to make decisions faster. Then they get to the second deadly sin, which is they fail to message from a buyer's point of view. So instead of messaging about what the buyer will be able to do better or differently, they talk about what the product does. That is an important distinction. It is a difference between what the buyer will be able to do better or differently versus what the product does. You need to be talking about what the buyer will be able to do, overcome that second deadly sin. And the third, you need to claim it. You need to claim it. You must say, what is different about this? Why should they choose you over any other vendor? And so that means the cadence and choreography of how you play this message pyramid out needs to look like this. You always want to start off, remember, client's world, message from the buyer's point of view. What challenge are they looking to overcome? Why are they even in the market for something like your solution today? But folks, don't go from that challenge to the is, go from the challenge to the do, because that buyer is going to be able to do something better or differently to overcome that challenge. And that's going to mean something to them. That's going to mean that they're going to have some outcomes that they don't have today and overcome that third challenge, because they're going to be able to do that only with your differentiated capability. I feel like this is a little bit of a test for me, because this is one of Tim's favorite concepts and the pioneer of this concept at Corporate Visions. But I would say, Tim, I love your thoughts on where sellers fall down in this message pyramid, and specifically what do they most fail to articulate in that compelling story?
Yeah, so I want to go back to this idea that, and I'm seeing some of it in the chat, it's the story you tell and the skill with which you tell the story that becomes the differentiation. And when it comes to talking about differentiators, the natural tendency is to run to what you think is a unique capability and talk about it. So like Doug identified here, the discipline of first talking about the challenge, the threat, the missed opportunity, and why it is such. Like, why is this a big deal? So being able to talk about the challenge in a meaningful way to that customer so that they viscerally feel what that challenge is, and they're like, yeah, I'm experiencing something similar. And then when typically we want to make a beeline to the is, when somebody acknowledges they have that challenge and is like, I got something for that. And the reality is, you want to talk about the do layer. The other word I'll add to the do layer, Doug, if you would write the word contrast. The main mechanism in decision making is, do I see enough contrast between the way I'm doing it today and the way you say I'll be doing it different or better tomorrow? The do layer is about, here's the challenge, and the reason it's a challenge is because this is how you're doing it today. Here's how you should or could and will be doing it differently tomorrow. So now they see the value of that, because they see the comparison between the challenge and how they're doing it today and the way they'll do it differently tomorrow. So they're going like, well, yeah, if I do that differently, I didn't even know that was possible to do it like that tomorrow. Now, all of a sudden, it's a priority problem. And they don't even know what the is yet. Like, your goal is to get them sort of almost begging to hear what the is. and because, like, even if the isn't like in and of itself a world-beating concept, it now is, because they need to do something differently. And even before you go to the is, like, I see people missing that means level. Like you say, here's the difference, and then and it's not just because it's different, it's because it's better. This is what it means to you to overcome this challenge that you didn't even know you could overcome, or didn't realize was as big a challenge, or had as big an impact, and now you can do it better. And in doing this, here's what I'm saying, folks, is all of a sudden your is seems really even more different than it might be. The key, again, is how you tell the story, and skill with which you tell it is, even if you land on the is and it's somewhat similar to the is of another company, the experience in getting to it and understanding, and the trust you've built and the confidence that you've built in telling the story in this way, means that when you get to the is, they're going to be like, yeah, if another company has this, they don't even know how important it is or how it's used, or there's so much to the words and the order with which you tell your stories that makes the difference in an area that is discernibly similar. So yeah, we've tested this and can show you that the way this story is told is even more important than the is itself.
And I think I'd add, Tim, you and I were chatting about this before we came online, but in addition to do, in addition to contrast, what's going to make that section come to life even more, jot down the words, folks, telling details. Telling details, because a couple of years ago, we researched what is the best way to tell this story and to articulate that do level, that contrast between today and tomorrow. And a lot of folks are in a feature benefit type sale or just talking about the value that something brings. But what we found in the study was that it is these telling details, this emotional language, not necessarily a ton more language, but language that infects, language that lands a punch, a visceral emotional punch that doesn't just describe an action verb today and an action verb tomorrow, but gets down to those really painful moments that a client feels in their current state situation and contrast that with the emotional high of future state as well. So yes, it is contrast. Yes, it is what will the client be able to do differently, but described with heightened visual emotional language that really sticks. Again, the story you tell, the skill with which you tell it, that really sticks in the mind's eye, creating a visual picture for the buyer of the pain of the status quo of today, coupled with the amazingness of tomorrow as well. The telling details, the words you select matter immensely to how much contrast your buyer perceives and how important they believe that challenge is to be solved.
Yeah, great question just came up from David. Do you suggest you ask the buyer what outcome they desire from the work you would do, or would you apply your experience and expertise to demonstrate what the outcome will mean to them? Here's the thing that I think you need to realize is that the buyer, the way you establish differentiation and trust is often just in, like we said, what you say and how you say it. And part of that comes from the idea that you see more people who look like them than they do. And part of the reason you're even in the room is this insatiable appetite for voyeurism, where it's like, what are others doing? What are you seeing? I don't want to miss something. Like, don't ask me what I already know. Tell me something I don't know. And that's why the do layer is so important. Like, you're revealing to them an understanding that you've amassed some level of critical expertise and experience about current situations for people like them, and then what better situations can look like and what their outcomes have been. So that really comes through in, hey, other people like you have been struggling with this. Is this true for you? It's what we see in many organizations like you who have similar installed, operations. And what's happening out there is people are making this move, contrast, and trying to fix this problem and do it in this new, different way. And here's the outcomes they're seeing. How meaningful would that be in your organization? So it's the level, like differentiation, and again, without trying to blur the lines, there's a level of providing expert insights in and through your differentiation, and arguably vice versa. Is like, as you differentiate, you're doing that through expert insights. And so the power here is really in, you've seen this, you've done this with lots of people who look like them before, and now we're going to let you in on it. Because that's not insulting. That's actually desired. People want to know what they might be missing and what you're seeing in others who look like them, because you see more people who look like them than they do.
And that is why demonstrate clear differentiation is but one of the great 8, because it is important. It is necessary. You saw buyers rating it high when you win and low when you do not. It is a necessary component. It's also why these 8 skills happen along the buyer's journey from left to right. There are things that sellers must do at each layer. Your differentiation will feel a whole lot weaker if the extra insights haven't been provided, and vice versa. Even your differentiation, you could articulate it exceptionally. But if you then don't help to justify the business decision thereafter, it's going to continue to get harder along the way. So each play a part in your sales team guiding the buyer through their deciding journey along the way. But I want to come back here in the last few minutes, come back to this concept of sellers have to know if they are good or not at these things. And who better to tell them than buyers? Because ultimately, if sellers aren't getting that feedback, as you saw from the data earlier, if they are not hearing from buyers as to where they are, their win rates in 2023 were 40% worse than the win rates of those who did hear from their buyers and as a result changed their behavior. And so we here over the last few months have been working with our clients to put that feedback in the hands of sellers. And so what you see on your screen here in front of you folks is a very simple email alert coming in from buyer feedback. And you can see here that if you were the seller on this particular deal, you can see that the buyer actually rated this seller somewhat compelling, 4 out of 7. So middle of the bell curve. You'll also notice that's a little bit below this organization's average, excuse me, but behind this organization's best-in-class performance. And so it's about guiding then your teams to get the help they need to improve their performance. It's not just about buyer feedback in the abstract. There's goodness there, don't get me wrong. But it's then how does a seller use that buyer feedback to then improve along the way? Click into that Get Help, and you're right at coachable nuggets, coachable insight, coachable video, where a seller, through the self-motivation of a buyer just telling them, hey, you lost that deal because you could not differentiate, and going to the content they need. And you actually see a video of Tim here on the Venn diagram right there as well, along with the message pyramid, guiding the seller to improve on the very thing that buyers said they were not great at. Also looking up here at where's the organization fit today? So the seller can very clearly see, where am I on that spectrum? Is this an area where I truly need to improve? But not only that, here's at the team level, at the organizational level, as you, as leaders are looking to make your big bets in 2024 and beyond, having at your disposal buyer feedback that shows you where should you make investments. I don't know if the investment environment is going to get looser, tighter next year. Your prediction is as good as mine. But knowing precisely where your investments are going to go to make the best fit in your sales team across individual deals, across individual sellers, specific buyer feedback on specific topics, you name it, buyer feedback can be the engine for your sales development in 2024 and beyond. At the org level, the team level, the individual level, giving every seller the tools to hear from buyers where there are gaps and fulfilling those gaps, learning from them, so you can be part of the 40% that has a higher win rate in 2024 and beyond. Tim, I saw you come off mute there. Anything to add?
Yeah, I'm just, excuse me, I'm still reading some of the quotes or comments here. And I think that somebody wrote, it's very challenging to train story and skill like this, right? To get somebody, because we're saying basically the story you tell and the skill with which you tell it is a differentiation. We're basically saying salespeople with their lips moving is the last bastion of competitive differentiation. But so are your customers, right? They're basically saying you lose because you didn't do this, not because your product, like you lose more often because you didn't talk about it right versus the product itself is not good enough. So that means this is an essential core skill that must be taught. And I think it's just, this is going to be like living in the matrix right now, gang, as I try to explain the answer to this question. The reality is that the story and the curriculum that you present to your seller isn't as important as what you do to make the behavior change happen. We know this as a training company, right? So like even our differentiation, we like to say, oh, our curriculum is the most awesomest because it's backed by research. But if we don't do something to help the skill become a behavior change, then it's a miss. And so I would argue that our differentiation has to be how we ensure adoption and business impact and behavior change, maybe even more so than the curriculum itself. And so our expectation when we go in and talk to a prospect is, let us tell you the story of behavior change and business outcomes that come from skills training, because a lot of people have pretty good curriculum. And you're going to try and discern the difference in the curriculum, but that's not where the difference is made. It's made out here. So that's what I mean. It's like living in the matrix. What I would tell you is, too often people are neglecting role play. And it's because it's inconsistent in terms of the quality of role play that managers deliver. It's not available at scale because there's just not enough managers and not enough manager time to get this done. And somebody asked here, will AI tech do this better? Yes. AI-based role play is here. And we've built it for all of our skills training, and just including it in the skills training because demonstrate practice and proven proficiency are essential, especially in these soft skills. And unless you get enough at-bats and repetitions and get meaningful feedback and scoring and get to go back and do that again, which is only something AI can do, you're not going to get the level of confidence, the level of competence in any skill or any story. And so the power of role play, but now with AI doing it at scale, is something you need to consider. So it's attached to all of our skills training, but there's companies out there building this that can build them custom for you as well. We've ignored coaching, fluency, practice, and role play too long and hoped for skill change. The other thing I would say about skill change is that people learn best when they're in a deficit, when they're in a moment where they're like, holy crap, I need this now. The customer feedback we just showed you reveals to a seller, this is something you need to do better. It creates a moment of deficit, which creates a learning opportunity. Like all of a sudden, I'm more open to learning something in a moment I'm in deficit, and customer feedback puts me in deficit. So is the learning available right now in the situation where I find myself in a deficit? Too much of this training happens on a calendar and a schedule that has nothing to do with the real world need, application, or confronting that deficit. So the next thing you need to look for in any training to stick is, after good old-fashioned repetitive role play, is that you need to be able to serve it up in the moment that the seller finds themselves in a deficit, either when they are prepping to get that meeting right, or now they've heard they've done it poorly a couple times and now they're ready to learn. And are your systems in place to give them situational training in a moment of deficit for that particular rep in their deficit and the next rep in their deficit, and as opposed to just like, here's some peanut butter and we're going to spread it across you like you're a bunch of toast. Anyways, I digress a little bit, but that's those, if people are like, this doesn't, like, it's got to stick, there are ways to make it stick. And yes, AI is part of that solution.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I'll close this out. Again, it's all about the story. The story you tell, the skill with which you tell it. And our friend, Mr. Gladwell, certainly took that to heart and popularized something that was an unoriginal idea. You could say that Malcolm Gladwell created his own value wedge along the way because he told an exceptional story. As always, we like to thank folks for joining us on the webinar, and make sure that we give back to you. So you see the QR code on your page and the short link there as well to download a checklist for great differentiation. Because as you heard from Tim and I, there are things you can do, both from a messaging perspective, a skill perspective, and as you just heard, an AI practice perspective to ensure you get better. You can also link these skills with the expert insights we shared in October, the business justification we shared in November, and the remaining grade 8 skills that we will share across early 2024. But it's been a great pleasure across this year to deliver some insight to all of you through these webinars. Tim, thanks as always, and we will see everybody in 2024.